Okay. Hey everyone. Welcome to Juvenile Justice lecture video for Chapter 2. So obviously, this particular chapter focus uh, is more in depth about juveniles. In particular, what we're looking at is the nature and extent of delinquency. And so obviously we need to talk about what delinquency is. Um, and so delinquency is criminal behavior in air quotes. Obviously, there are certain crimes that are considered delinquency that are related only to juveniles, things like curfew and things like that. But in general, what we're talking about is we're talking about the different types and understanding of crime as it is applied to juveniles. So something we got to start with right off the bat. The textbook talks about it, and it's important to say high risk children get involved in more than 1 million serious illegal acts each year. This is why it's a problem, but it's also important to note high risk children. Let that sit for just a moment. High risk children. It's not juvenile delinquents get involved, it's high risk children. These are individuals who may not have ever planned or thought they were going to commit a crime, and something has happened that has put them in this situation where they commit a crime. High risk children are the individuals who are identified due to several factors, which we'll talk about later, that leads them to a higher chance of committing a crime. And so it's important to understand that when what we're talking about here, yes, it's juvenile justice. Yes, we're talking about juvenile delinquents. We're talking about people that have already committed crimes, but we're also talking about the numerous children that have yet to commit a crime, but due to their situation are at a higher risk of committing a crime. So that's just how we start off. So, first off, how do we measure delinquency? Well, the first and obvious answer is we need to look at the data. So, this is where I get to tell you welcome to criminal justice, where you are a social science, which means there's lots of data and research. If you got into this because you were like, oh, I'm not going to have to do any research or anything, it's not completely true. A Even a good officer knows how to look up the actual good data. So in general, when we understand how to measure delinquency, we need to look at the data. And so if you took intro before this, you might be familiar with this, but notice I have bolded U, C, and R, which, oh yeah, it's the Uniform Crime Report. And so just a quick reminder, a brief reminder of what the Uniform Crime Report is. This is a nationally compiled amount of data run through the FBI that is essentially combining all jurisdictions all across the United States, looking at their crime rates and what's reported. And what they do is they put it all together and give you general statistics nationwide about crime. That's the Uniform Crime Report. But there are some issues with it. First thing is that fewer than half of all victims report a crime. We know this is the dark figure of crime, is that a majority of crimes never get reported. So while the Uniform Crime Report is great to understand the trends, it's not perfect. The arrest data counts only those who have been caught, so open cases aren't part of the data of this, as well as, non-reported crimes. So another thing, and this is important to know, is that victimless crimes are significantly undercounted in the overall report. So they tend to be serious offenses with clear victims, but victimless crimes like petty theft tend to not qualify as much in this. So another thing, and these last two things are very connected, and if you're interested in this, there's other classes to talk about this, but arrest decisions, the criteria for those vary among officers. And it's important to remember If you took Intro to Criminal Justice, this is a reminder. If you haven't, this is your first time hearing it. Officers have a lot of freedom of choice. They have this opportunity to engage with the community as they see fit. And so, based off of that, some officers may be stricter on arrest and others may be super lenient. So, the criteria for arrest decision varies between officers, even within a single jurisdiction. So that's important to note. And the other thing is arrests may reflect biases, some individual predetermined or pre-understood beliefs that may or may not be true. And so the Uniform Crime Report, it's really good for getting like the solid big picture, big strokes of data. But obviously there are some failures in that, and that's where we have some other kind of data collection things. But it's important to note, and I know we are not research. This is not what I'm talking about. Like, I'm not asking you to go out and conduct research. But what I am talking about here is that when research is conducted about these things, an important thing is sampling. And so if you've not taken a psychology or a social science or a social work or whatever that may be type of class and you're not sure what this means, sampling is the taking of a particular or a wide enough collection of individuals when looking at the data so that it is the most appropriate to the masses. Sampling, you're looking for particular groups. You're looking for particular data. If you just ask 20 students at Erie County Community College, you're not really sampling Erie County. You're sampling the community college students. If you're trying to sample the whole Erie County, you need to go wider, go further out. So that's what we mean by sampling. And so, much like the Uniform Crime Report, we also have the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is a larger, more robust survey. This is also now technically, I believe, run by the FBI, but the idea is that this is a almost self-report survey, which you see right there is the next thing we're going to be talking about. But this is a survey sent to victims of crime in general. It's sent out not just to victims, but like everyone, and it's asking, have you been a victim of crime? Please talk about this. This gives us some of that data that is not reported crimes, that fewer than half of all victims report crimes. That's what we get here a little bit. So we do get more data. And the idea is that when we combine all these data results, we tend to start noticing trends, noticing ideas pop up. And so it's important that no matter what you want to say about conducting research, it's an important piece of good police work, of good human work. Like, to understand why something works the way it does is important. So self-report surveys really are just what they sound like. They are surveys or research that is essentially provided by the individual. You're asked a series of questions and say, just answer it honestly. And the idea is that an individual will feel more comfortable talking about it than if they're forced to. And so, something that we do need to talk about, and I can't believe I have to say it this way, but so the impact of culture and subculture definitely has a direct effect on juvenile justice as well as juvenile delinquency in general. And this is the not to be a boomer, but some kids act in a particular way or may actually participate in crimes. One particular lifestyle I can think of is the thug life group. Individuals who are all about that thug life, that gangsta life. it glorifies crime, and so that's a subculture that supports criminal behavior. But there are definitely people who participate in that aren't really, committing crimes. They just want to seem hard so that their music or whatever their particular avenue they're trying to go down is more quote believable. So clearly that has an impact. And like I said, not to be a boomer, but really our culture where we live and the subcultures that we're groups with, they do have an impact on especially juveniles as they are developing. A lot of the psychology of a developing young mind is that we try to find groups of like-minded individuals. We look for those peer groups. That's the one of the most important things as we get to a school age, is that humans look for others that are like us. So we look for these subcultures. We look for these minor groups within the larger group that we belong into. And so that has a clear impact on the way we view crime. It really does make a difference whether you want to believe it or not. There's plenty of data on this. Um, but that's just a little bit about surveys. Because of the self-reporting surveys, sometimes because of those subcultures, we have skewed data. So they might be, oh well, I committed all these crimes because you want to pretend like you have a rap sheet, but you really don't. It's a weird sub piece, but it's important to understand that those things do have an impact. All right, I kind of got a little off track there, but it's important still to talk about it. But one thing, so our textbook has quite a few of these uh, data tables and things like that. But one thing that they brought up was the arrest trends from the 2013 Uniform Crime Report. And I thought it was worthwhile to specifically highlight this data because it really shows an issue and a larger issue within the juvenile justice system. And so they were looking at arrest trends from 2013, and so in all crime, the percentage of all crime that was committed by individuals under the age of 18 was 9%, whereas all crime was of this 9%, 3% was under the age of 15. So that means 6% was between the ages of 15 and 18. That's a significant amount of crime. When we look at serious property damage, 19% were under the age of 18, and only 4% of that 19 were under the age of 15. And serious violent crime, 11% of all arrests in 2013 for serious violent crimes, 11% of those were under the age of 18. And of that 11%, 3% was under the age of 15. And I have here, the book has all of it, but adults accounted for obviously 89% of all serious violent crimes, just so you understand. Yeah, this makes sense, but 11% of people under the age of 18 committing serious violent crime, that is a large number when you consider how many people are incarcerated, how many crimes are actually reported. If it's only half of all crimes are reported, 11% of 50% is a decent amount. So, what I'm trying to get at is even though these percentages are a lot smaller than the large piece, which makes sense, it doesn't mean that it's a small number of juveniles that are committing crimes. It's still a large amount. And something that the book does bring up is that there has been a decreasing crime rate overall. You can look at the trend. There is a decline in a lot of crimes. Some crimes have spiked. It's a natural progression thing. You'll notice it the longer you're in criminal justice and the more you're interested in it. You'll start noticing that there are both times of year and general times of like society where crimes tend to spike. So like during deep recessions and things like that, we see changes in robbery and property crimes, but we also then, see a change in violent crimes. We'll also get to it in a little bit, but those things also change depending on the time of year and location. So it's important to note that despite the decreasing crime rate, juveniles are overrepresented. So think about that for a second. This percentage, it's overrepresented despite the crime rate going down. So the idea is that this percentage is staying the same or getting higher as the overall rate gets lower. And that is not how statistics should work. So there is some deeper issues going on with juvenile justice that we need to figure out. And unfortunately, there's not an easy one to answer. So, one national survey that is important to bring up because, well, it's possible you may or may not have participated in it at some point, but it is the Monitoring the Future. It is the national self-reporting survey that is sent out to juveniles, I believe, like age 6 or 7 all the way through 18. And it changes a little bit the questions they ask, but they do ask a whole big list of them. And so I provided you table 2.2 on page 42. So that way, if you really want to emphasize some of more of the crimes, you can. I just wanted to highlight a couple in particular, but the whole chart is there. And that was the Monitoring the Future 2014, posted obviously in 2015. So they have a list of types of delinquencies, and so I chose set fire on purpose, breaking and entering, gang or group fighting, and auto theft because they are not typically crimes. Gang fighting maybe, but most of those you don't really think of when you think of juveniles. Things like shoplifting makes sense for a teenager, I guess. So set fire on purpose, just going to point out, regardless of the fact that it's 1% committed at least once and 1% more than once, that's 2% more than I thought would be answering that they set fire on purpose. So just for me, at least, that was a weird one that stood out to me. I also chose breaking and entering. At least 10% of those surveyed said that they had committed a breaking and entering at least once, and 13% said more than once. And then when we get to gang and group fighting, 7% nationally committed at least once, 6% more than once. And auto theft, again, like set fire on purpose, 2% each. Like, these are statistics that I know when we say 2%, 1%, 7%, 10%, it seems low because we're used to thinking of higher numbers. But when you consider going all the way back to the very beginning when we were looking at, let's see, more than 1 million serious illegal acts each year. High-risk children, more than 1 million. Well, 10% of 1 million is a lot. It's not 5 kids. It's a lot. 1% is not 5 kids either. It's a decent amount. We're talking hundreds. Like, these numbers, they may seem small, but they do have a larger number. And it's a human problem. We have a hard time comprehending large numbers. So we do things like this where we put them into the smaller, easily identifiable, but it does a disservice sometimes. But anyway, if you're interested in the data from Monitoring the Future, I believe they still actually are doing Monitoring the Future surveys, so I will have to check out myself, but feel free to look up to see if they're more recent data. But this does come right from the textbook. And so this is where I kind of teased it a little bit ago, but social and economic conditions can alter the trajectory of delinquency. Oddly enough, weather impacts crime, and so do geographical features, not geological. All of this is to say, it's not just one thing. It's not just a simple, oh, well, that's what that means. No, There is a lot more to the whole idea of delinquency. So when we talk about social and economic conditions can alter the trajectory of delinquency, I need to emphasize poverty does not cause delinquency. However, delinquency is higher in poverty. So, social scientists and criminal justice experts, we identify that there is a connection between poverty and criminal behavior in general, both juvenile delinquency and adult criminal behavior. There is a connection between crime and poverty and economic status. But it's not a one-to-one. It's important to note because a lot of people are like, well, yeah, if you have the money, you don't need to commit crime. You're right. But we also see people who have money commit crime. So that's not really the answer. There's something more to it. So social scientists know there's a connection. We just don't have a statistically strong and viable candidate to say this is how they're connected. But we know it exists. And so this is what I mean by it can change the trajectory of delinquency, can alter this. We see higher rates in those who are living in poverty. If you improve that situation, there's a high likelihood that you can change that path of delinquency. And in a similar but not related vein, weather impacts crime. And remember how I said we see trends in the data? So in times of financial struggle, you see spikes in certain crimes. Same with the weather. When the weather is nice and warm out, we see an increase in crimes like robbery, murder, things like that. But when it's too hot, those crime rates decrease. The same with when it's too cold. There's a golden situation of proper weather conditions that you see a spike in crime, and the rest of the time they usually drop into what we would say normal ranges. So weather actually makes a difference. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of weird stuff on it. Learn a little bit about meteorology. I know we have a meteorology class, so you'll learn a little bit about weather patterns. It's just a cool little tidbit that people don't tend to really notice. And then, so as I said, geographical features also matter. These are definitely related to the social and economic conditions because we're talking there's a difference in population, in cultural values, economic statuses, gun ownership, general population beliefs, the size of the police force, the activity of police force. Like geographical features change a lot. If it's an area of high crime, probably going to impact your chances of delinquency fairly strongly. If you're not, probably not. So, what I'm trying to say is that delinquency is not a you fit this one quality, therefore you are going to be a delinquent. No, there's so many factors that play into it. It's why we don't have a simple answer or simple fix to any kind of criminal behavior. It's a very complex situation, even more so when you involve maturing children going into adulthood. It's a tumultuous time. The body is changing, the mind is changing, a lot's going on. We'll talk about that as well here in a minute or two. But I want to put out a question. This is not a question I expect you to answer like right now or to do in an essay on an exam or anything, but it's a question that I want you to think about. It might be an extra credit question at some point. It might be an essay question on a final, but I want you to think about, because there's not a clear answer on this one. How long should the system give a youth to change? How long? Do we let them have unlimited chances and time to become a better member of society, or do we limit the amount of time? Um, it's something to think about. Like I said, there's not a direct one-to-one answer on that. I just want to make you think a little bit. So, teen crime trends again. This is pages 44 to 45. I'm going to cover a couple of the bigger pieces, and it's related to this kind of changing ecosystem of what can impact delinquency. But this is from the Focus on Delinquency part. It's called Shaping Teen Crime Trends. And it looks at a lot of different factors, and they break it down into some sections. But some of the big takeaways that I just want to emphasize to all of you is that kids with jobs are the most delinquent, not the ones who don't have a job. And if you're like, that doesn't make any sense, well, the logic behind it is that there's a lack of parental supervision for those who have a job. They also have more freedom. They know that they have a job. They know that their parents don't expect them to be home at a certain time because they know they're at work. So kid can get away with stuff and do things what they want. Uh, Related to this is that when parents are unemployed, they tend to find that individuals are more supervised, and then therefore the kids are less delinquent because if the parent doesn't have work to worry about or something else, they're worrying about their kids. So there's an interesting balance between jobs and delinquency that more research definitely should be done, because it's a very interesting reverse trend than what logic would say. Uh, an obvious one is that racial conflict increases delinquency. So when there's conflict between people of different backgrounds where they tend to be against each other, yeah, there tends to be an increased delinquency. However, what we find is that when more integration happens, it leads to less crime. So there may be some racial conflict in the beginning and causes an increase. Eventually, when it becomes a blended neighborhood and a blended area and it becomes more accepted and they're not fighting each other, there's less crime overall. Like, there's a clear difference in this. Something that a lot of extreme conservatism, anti-immigrant individuals believe, is that immigrant children are going to be delinquents just like their parents who broke the laws to get here. Ignoring all of those arguments, in general, the data actually shows that after a generation or two of being here, immigrant children are less likely to be delinquent and less likely to be like their parents. They essentially become a naturalized citizen at that point. It's an important piece of data that I don't think a lot of us think about, but I urge you to think about your own family. How many generations has lived in the United States? So, like, when did your family arrive in the United States? And even further, I'm going to ask a slightly different question, but related to this. You're here at EC3, you're at the community college. How many of your parents went to college and got a college degree? How many of your grandparents? Great grandparents? What generation of student are you? As the generations go, things change, and it's very interesting to look at from a social science perspective. But from a crime perspective, if there is a positive impact in the environment, even if a parent was a delinquent, as the generations go further, the kids are less likely to be delinquent. It's a very interesting piece. Obviously, access to guns impact delinquency in a negative way, in that they encourage more crime, not deter crime. This comes down to the idea that, is a juvenile mature enough to understand when is the wrong time and use of a gun? It gets into a deeper thing. And this one only because I am a I'm an avid video game player. I will admit that. If you know me outside of this class at all, you know that I'm a big video game person. I'm a big nerd. Uh, I have hated for years the violent video games cause violence or violent video games cause school shooters and all these things. And the data does not support that. Not in the way that people like to claim and scapegoat. So violent media does not impact delinquency in a statistically significant way. The issue is that there are violent tendencies that are already present in an individual that engaging in that media encourages the continuation of that already under under the surface kind of violent tendency. So, is there a connection? Yes, but only in the sense that an individual was already prone to those behaviors before engaging in that media that encourages it. So, does violent media cause violence? No. Does violent media cause violence for those who have a violent tendency? Yes. It's understanding how the data works. All right, and then last thing, it's not actually part of this piece. It's on the page after that, but it's kind of part of this as well that I just wanted to talk about, and that is that girls are more likely to run away from home than boys are. They're also more likely to get into sex work and prostitution and potentially human trafficking because, well, excuse me, while sex work itself as a whole is not a negative or bad thing, the human trafficking aspect of sex work is very problematic and is something that needs fixed. But that's something that's not for this class and something that I hope one day we can fix. But moving on, this is just a particular piece of data that the book brings up, and I think it's important to note. 40 million European Americans, or as we know them, white, and there are 10 million African Americans aged 5 to 17. That's across the board as of the data that they pulled. So this is roughly around 2014. This is a 4-to-1 ratio. So for every one African American child, there is 4 white children. That's important because, according to the 2013 data, this is not juvenile crime, this is all crime. 63% of all crimes were committed by a white individual, 34% were committed by a black individual. The 4-to-1 ratio, okay, fair enough, but that is a large percentage. 4 times of 34 is more than 63%. So it is a larger number of African Americans who are, being charged with criminal activity. So a particular piece, I don't have it written down here, but from the book, black juveniles account for more than 1/2 of all juveniles arrested for violent crimes, and nearly 1/3 of all juveniles arrested for property crimes are African American. Remember, 4-to-1 ratio. And for violent crimes, they make up half of the juvenile arrest record and 1/3 of property crime. That is a significantly high percentage of African American youth who are making up what is 34% of all crime. That's not good. That is showing that there is potentially, and this is something that we talk about in Race, Crime, and Justice, but you get it in pretty much all the classes because, well, we're in a modern world where this is something we need to talk about, and that's institutional bias. And bias just means that there is a particular way of thinking that is predetermined, that is looking at preference wise. It's not necessarily good or bad, but In this case, this is not great. There is an institutional bias, statistically speaking, that black individuals are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested than white individuals. That shows an institutional bias. And so our text puts forward a couple ideas, and one in particular is really important, and I think we need to identify more often because we tend to get into this issue. It's the cycle of hostility. And I'm not assuming anyone's gender, ethnicity, race, anything of that nature, but from a few of the people I know in my life who are in different communities, I know one of the things that a couple people I know of, they were raised and told that when you interact with a police officer, you are extremely polite and you don't show any kind of hostility or anger because that's how you get hurt. And I want to emphasize the people I'm talking about are not white. So, the cycle of hostility is the idea that there's institutional racism that leads young black individuals to be hostile towards police, and police view the hostility as a potentially dangerous situation, so they respond with violence and escalate that situation, which leads to more hostility within that community, which leads to more police violence and or rather violence by police again. And this is the problem. There's more to this problem, obviously, because this is a very complicated issue. But it's important to note that the cycle of hostility is a real issue within juvenile justice in particular, because we see that percentage of African American young male having the kind of, I put in air quotes, attitude, but the aggression, the why me kind of moment. And that's what leads to uh, officers viewing it as resisting arrest or doing something they're not supposed to, and that leads to violence when it doesn't need to be. There's misunderstandings across the board that lead to hostilities and problems, and so this is a complicated, complex issue that, as a white male individual, I'm not the person to fix this, but I will gladly put my voice towards it and remind everyone that this is a real issue and that we need to find ways to work through this and fix it for the better. But, you know, that's me. All right. And then we have Hubert M. Blaylock, 1967, putting forward racial threat theory. And it bothers me so much because once you hear it, you know exactly what it means. This is the idea that as the size of an African American population increases, the perceived threat of the white population also increases. They're afraid that the rise in African Americans in their community is going to, quote, wipe out them or remove them or be violent or attack them, and all of a sudden it's not okay. It's very prejudiced. It's very racist. It is 100%. But we know this thing exists because we see it happen. It's happened statistically and historically. Like, this is something that we need to address. And this is just another one of those ways that there is an institutional bias. So I kind of want to take it in a little positive direction before we, wrap up, because we just talked about a lot of negative down pieces, and I know criminal justice itself is a lot of times inherently down. So the good news is that a positive home life does have a positive impact on success. Delinquency rates in juveniles tend to not be as high when there's a positive home life, when things are going well across the board. Yes, it still happens. There are always going to be outliers, but in general, we see the data show that when there is a positive home life, where there's positive reinforcement, things are not concerning or worrying, things tend to be on the positive side. So, once again, I just remind you, poverty and delinquency, there's a connection, but what the heck is the connection? We don't know. Um, anyway, so let's look at a positive thing. Why does crime decline with age? And this is something that we do find from both a study that we're going to talk about real briefly from Marvin Wolfgang, 1972, Delinquency in a Birth Cohort. We see it in some other studies and things across the board that typically juveniles, unless they are a chronic reoffender, most juveniles will age out of their criminal behavior. So that's good, but why? And so the book gives out some really good answers, and I think if I even just asked you to come up with why do you think, I'm sure some of these would be things that you think about. And so things like growing older means having to face the future. Yeah, when you get older, a lot of, and this is not, I'm not trying to be a boomer and say like, oh, kids don't. No, what I'm talking about here in particular with facing the future, um, people who are unable to see the future for one reason or another, whether it be depression, whether it be just regular juvenile delinquency, whether it be anti authoritarianism, whatever it may be, when you can't see the long term future for yourself, you live in the moment and you go, well, I don't care. So when you get older, you tend to see that there is a future. And so when you face the future, usually the crime rate declines because you're like, yeah, I kind of want this in the future. And I guess I have to stop doing this. It's a complex thing. In relation to that, maturity comes the ability to resist the quick fix for problems. When you're young, you just want to get it fixed and done and move on. As you get older, you learn that that only works for a little bit of time. If you take the time to do the actual right way, it's more rewarding and it does for longer. So it is one of those things as age happens, so does that. Maturation coincides with increased levels of responsibility. As you get older, you tend to have more responsibilities. When you move out and live on your own, you got to do everything by yourself or whoever you're living with. It's a change. You get different responsibilities. If you have kids, those are responsibilities. If you have pets, those are responsibilities. If you have roommates, those are responsibilities. As you get older, you get more responsibility. And when you have more responsibility, you tend to not really have the time to goof around and be a juvenile delinquent. Perhaps one of the most positive things of all this is that personalities can change over time. Your personality when you are a kid is not the same personality you are as an adult. You can keep qualities of it, but you can also grow and change as a mature adult. And so personalities can change. As a kid, you might be very much F the police, I don't care. And as an adult, you might go, you know what? I may not like the police in general, but I understand that they are important to my particular society. So, yeah, I'm not going to be a juvenile delinquent and try to pick fights with cops. Just an example that's not a real example. I just came up with it off the top of my head. But our personalities can change. Young adults also become more aware of the risks of crime. And truly, as you get older, you tend to notice, especially if you're thinking about the future, you're like, there's a decent risk behind this crime. Oh, I'm part of a gang. There's a really good chance that I could be shot and killed. Yeah, I'm going to steal this. There's a really good chance I'm going to spend time in jail for this. You tend to be aware of the risk of crime because now you're thinking about the future, not just the past, or not just the present. And then one of the last things they say is the changes in human biology. And this is true. As we grow up, our bodies change. Some of us, you get sore, your legs don't work as well. Your bones and your knees and your joints all crack, and as you get older, your body changes in ways that are different. You might not be as flexible. You might not be as in shape as you used to be. Your metabolism may be slower. You may have a heart condition. You may pick any number of possible biological change, and it can probably have an impact on how you view crime. You might be like, I'm too old. The old classic Danny Glover from Lethal Weapon. I'm getting too old for this poop. Yeah, it's the reality. As you get older, your body changes, and for some people, that means I'm not committing crime anymore. For others, it means I'm committing new crimes. But that's a whole nother issue. And so we come to Marvin Wolfgang, 1972, Delinquency. Uh, in this, they studied longitudinally, which means over a long period of time, 9,945 Philly boys from ages birth to 18, and they followed them for quite a long time. And what they found is that 1/3 of the boys, which is 3,475, had police contact at some point. Whereas the rest, which is 6,470, had no police contact. So part of this shows that it's not everyone. They picked particularly Philadelphia because it is a decently high crime rate area, and part of the idea is to understand potentially if there is biological signs of delinquency. So these are individuals who are high risk to become a juvenile delinquent and become a chronic offender. And they found that only about 1/3 had some kind of police contact, which is surprisingly really good for a high concentrated, high risk control group. Not really control group, but a research group. And so what it breaks down to, that 1/3 that had police contact, the further data ends up going into looking at the difference between chronic and non-chronic recidivists. And so non-chronic recidivism is more than one repeating of a crime, but fewer than 5. But chronic recidivism is continuous arrests. And what we find is that the chronic recidivists are the ones that will end up continuing into adulthood. The chronic juvenile offenders continue into adulthood. This 1/3, a lot of them will go more to the chronic, but a good number will go non-chronic. They will be a couple times and then they'll be on their way. But for that, not a large group. But what the data shows from this study with all this information is that a good number of the crimes that are committed are actually from chronic recidivists, chronic offenders. They make up a large percentage of the crime. Not these people who do 1 to 4 times. These are the people that are always getting in trouble. And so we call this the continuity of crime. The continuity of crime is literally just that chronic juvenile offenders will continue committing crimes into adulthood. It doesn't just stop. And what this shows is that, unfortunately, if there's a pattern in childhood, there is likely to be a pattern in adulthood that follows. So it's important to know that this is something that needs to be overcome. 2 last things before we talk about Exhibit 2.2 on page 52, which I think is very important. Number 1, teens tend to be victimized by their peers. Obviously, at different levels of age and social connection, the victimization can change, but we tend and typically see teens being victimized by their peers, not by adults or that. The other thing is anti-bullying campaigns don't really work. So Another question for you to think of: how do we fix this? I argue that we don't necessarily have a direct answer. But to wrap up today's lecture, I really wanted to look at the exhibit, like I said, exhibit 2.2 on page 52. This is childhood risk factors for persistent delinquency. These are the kind of warning signs, the potential factors that lead to these chronic juvenile offenders. And so individual factors, they break it down into four main groups: individual factors, school and community factors, family factors, and peer factors. And so individual factors are things like early antisocial behavior, emotional factors like high behavioral activation, low behavioral inhibition, so hard time controlling themselves, poor cognitive development, low intelligence, and hyperactivity. That is not to say everyone with ADD and ADHD is going to be a juvenile delinquent, but if other factors go in with that, statistically speaking, there's a higher percentage they may be. School and community factors: failure to bond to school, poor academic performance, low academic aspirations, living in a poor family. Remember, socioeconomic does impact this. Neighborhood disadvantages, disorganized neighborhoods, concentration of delinquent peer groups, access to weapons. All of these things are risk factors for a chronic juvenile offender. Family factors like inconsistent parenting, maltreatment, family violence, divorce, parental psychopathology, familial antisocial behaviors, teenage parenthood, and large family sizes. All of these things are potential risk factors that make a child a high risk for becoming a chronic juvenile offender. And then peer factors like association with deviant peers, or worse yet, and something that we'll talk about later on this semester when we do briefly talk about school shooters, that is peer rejection. Peer rejection does have a fairly large impact on juvenile offenders. So it's important to note that just because some of these factors are true, or maybe a good number of them are true to you, does not mean that you are or were a juvenile offender. Or it just means that these are factors that when you have more than one in all of the categories, it tends to say that you are at a higher risk of becoming a chronic juvenile offender. If you have multiple of these factors, it just means you are at a high risk. So you are statistically part of our very first number at the very beginning. High risk children get involved in more than 1 million serious illegal acts each year. High risk. If you qualify, if you have several of these potential risk factors, then you are part of the high risk number when you were a kid. If you didn't commit crimes, guess what? You did dang well. If you did commit crimes, but now you're here and doing better, you did well. Celebrate the fact that you made it. I know it seems really weird, but it is a positive thing. If you are an individual like I am, who looked at all those risk factors and went, yeah, a lot of those really did apply to me, and you're here and you're doing well, celebrate that. Be proud. I'm going to try to end that with a happy note. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will see you in the next video.